Okay, guys, welcome to Module 1 of this class. Hopefully you watched everything in Module 0, the welcome video, the overview of the public policy pitch, so that way you feel good and about how the class is going to work and you're starting to get to know the other students in the class. Today, we're actually going to start talking about law and psychology. How do they interact together? Why do we have legal psychology? Why do we let the two fields join together? And so let's get started getting on the same page, because I often find that students can be a little bit confused depending on what your undergraduate major is. Like, what's the difference between psychology? What's the difference between law? So psychology is really the study of mind and behavior, right? This can be mental health, this can be memory, this can be decision-making processes, but it's really thinking about like sort of the internal state of the human being and how does it work. It's not just the rates at which things happen, right? That's often criminal justice or the law itself. So if you tell me X number of children testify every year, it's not psychology, that's a statistic, but it's not a psychological statistic. But if you tell me that children are the most worried about seeing the defendant when they testify, that is supported usually by empirical research. If you tell me that you just know that because that's what you think, that's okay, that's great. But to be psychology, it needs to be empirical and it needs to be studied, as Dr. Gail Goodman did in coming up with that particular fact that I gave you. So, like I just said, knowing how often they testify, not psychology. Knowing the effects of testifying, psychology. So what is the legal system or the law? How is it different? Well, that can be the criminal justice system. It can be the civil system. It can be legislation or bills. It's actually much broader than students think. And criminal justice, right, cares about behavior, and civil cares about behavior, but they don't study why the behavior comes about and what the behavior is. They go about regulating and making decisions about behavior. And they help society sort of function and decide, well, when should the legal system step in when people can't resolve things amongst themselves, or we don't want them to resolve things amongst themselves. So when you're thinking about the overlap between the two, when we tell you to use psychological research, you're thinking about empirical studies about mind and behavior. Also, one other thing to think about is actually, even as you guys go about your educational studies, laws affect that. So as we do this class, right, the law is very involved, particularly in the United States, as to the educational settings. We have Title IX, we have rules regarding FAFSA, we have Pell Grant legislation, right, which are laws that talk about how students could be funded. And so a lot of the things that you guys do from day to day actually are touched upon by the legal system. Maybe not the way you always think about it or you see on shows like CSI, but on the ways that matter to your everyday life. So should psychology influence the legal system? Previously in the United States, the courts really said no. They didn't think that law and psychology should interact together. They thought law should be based on jurisprudence or past laws, and that, you know, science had its place, but science place wasn't within the courts. But now that's not true. At least in the United States, law and psychology interact together on a number of different levels. And we're going to cover in this course a couple of different ways that psychology influences it. But there are so many ways we are not going to cover. And we're going to discuss in the lecture a few ways that it gets in actually into the legal system, sort of the method that it gets in. But we are going to miss, of course, in this course, some of the ways it gets in. We're going to miss important topics. We have other classes at FIU. I know there's other classes in the other countries as well. For instance, you can take online Children in the Law with me if you are so inclined and learn more about children in the legal system. We're also going to talk about some arguments as to why psychology should sometimes not play a role, because everyone does not think always that psychology should play a role. And so there are arguments for and against it, and we will be talking about that throughout the class, that maybe there are times when psychology should not be stepping in, or it's more challenging for psychology, or psychology needs to improve. So how does psychology influence the legal system? Today, we're going to cover three main ways. We're going to cover expert testimony in the courts. We're going to talk about amicus briefs, which is sort of a uniquely sort of like, I'd say in the United States, it's probably more active than other countries, but, you know, in Europe, there are definitely roles for this. And third, research on the legal system itself. So before we can think about expert testimony in the courts, I'm going to make you all lawyers. Congratulations. You have passed, you know, the bar, whatever the certification is in your own country, and you have a client, and the client comes into your office and they say, one day I was driving my car down the road, another curb swerved right into my lane, and I had to violently veer off the street. I was injured because of this car accident, and I had to go to the hospital and miss class. I want you, as my new lawyer, to sue the person who almost hit me. They should pay me money and they should go to jail. So, new lawyer, you have to think about a couple of things. And one of them is the client wants to know if you're bringing this case in civil or criminal court, and what are the differences between civil and criminal court. So let me go over it for the US, and then we'll go over it for Brazil. And I know our colleagues from Mozambique are going to help fill in either in the chat or additional videos. So in the US criminal court, you have to make it versus the civil court. The party that brings a case in the US is the state. So if you think back to those crime shows that you've watched, right, it's always someone versus the state of Missouri or the state of Florida, or it's people versus that person's name, right? And that's because the state brings it. It's actually not the victim who brings it. It's the state or the federal government who brings the case. They are the one who prosecutes the case, because the idea is crimes are crimes against us all. And says the society actually holds the right. And once the state brings the case, they have to prove the case. Everyone knows this, who's from the US, maybe even other countries, beyond a reasonable doubt. TV shows love that standard. In criminal court, we have a very high standard, beyond a reasonable doubt. The idea is that it's super high because criminal courts deprive you of your freedom and your liberty, which is one of our most fundamental interests, right? It's enshrined for us in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Freedom and liberty, we talk about it all the time. And so we really want it to be a high standard, beyond a reasonable doubt, because we don't want people going to jail without that high evidentiary standard. Now, you will learn in a couple of modules from us that there are wrongful convictions, and sometimes people go to jail even when they should not. So we also have in criminal court, the remedy is jail or fines, which is different than in civil court, which you'll learn in a second. So you can actually get someone to be imprisoned, as I mentioned, and you can sometimes charge them a fine. And most importantly, if you guys remember from Miranda, from all those TV shows, the defendant has a constitutional right to an attorney. So as they say in Miranda, if you cannot afford an attorney, one will be given to you. So what about US civil court? How is it different? In US civil court, the plaintiff actually initiates the case. They bring it. It is not the state. The individual who thinks that they are harmed brings the case. Then what happens is that there's actually a slightly lower standard of proof. The standard of proof is what we call a preponderance of the evidence. So a little more than not. We said beyond a reasonable doubt is really high. Preponderance of evidence is a little bit more than not. The outcome for civil is you get money or an injunction, which is to get the party to stop doing something, sometimes to start, but usually stop. You cannot send someone to jail in civil court in the United States. That's a criminal court sanction. And unlike criminal court, you have to pay for an attorney yourself in the United States. Sometimes you can get legal aid to represent you if you're low income. So that serve nonprofit organizations or groups, but you don't have an absolute right to an attorney in civil cases in the United States. But what about Brazil?
Brazil, we have three different kinds of courts. First, we have the criminal courts, and it's really interesting because when you think about it, how those Brazilian courts are similar to the US, because many of their attributes were based on the US legal system. So Debbie, if you could, the Brazilian criminal court, it has a few of the things that Debbie just told you.
Oops, Sydney, I think you froze.